today, we're diving into Peter Zeihan's book, Disunited Nations, The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World. And his core claim is pretty bold. The world isn't just, falling apart. He says it's actually being pushed apart.
Yeah, it's definitely provocative. Zeihan's fundamental argument is that the global order we've known since World War II, the one built around the American alliance system, that's ending. He doesn't just see it as changing, he sees it as finished. He calls the whole period a bizarre stretch of history.
Right.
Basically a time when the usual forces like geography and power politics were kind of put on hold. An anomaly.
Okay, let's unpack how this American order actually worked, why Zeihan thinks it's breaking down now, and crucially, what that might mean. For different countries, sure, but also for you listening, just trying to make sense of all this change. This isn't about getting bogged down. It's about grasping the core drivers so you can really see the bigger picture. All right, let's dig in. Zeihan says American power didn't just, end history, it froze it in place. So what was the deal? What did the U.S. actually offer with this Bretton Woods order after the war?
Well, it was incredibly far-reaching. Zeihan breaks it down into three main pillars. First, just total physical security. The U.S. basically promised its military might, tanks, troops, ships, its nuclear umbrella to protect its allies, anywhere. Second, and this is maybe the most unique part, was freedom of the seas. The U.S. Navy guaranteed maritime security globally for everyone's ships. They dealt with pirates, secured trade routes. Zeihan even points out that during Vietnam, they were still protecting North Vietnamese commerce on the high seas. And third, massive economic incentives. Think Marshall Plan funding, guaranteed access to the huge American market, open trade for everything, raw materials, fuel, fertilizer, equipment. It basically created what he calls a single integrated economic system.
That is quite the setup. So if it was so good, why does Zeihan call it one of the most bizarre periods ever? And why is it ending? What's this American disenchantment about?
Well, the main strategic reason for the whole thing, containing the Soviet Union, basically disappeared when the Cold War ended.
Right.
So without that big threat, Zeihan argues the U.S. started feeling like its allies weren't really holding up their end of the deal anymore. He highlights three specific moments in the early 2000s that he thinks really cemented this feeling in Washington. First, 2001, that collision between a Chinese fighter jet and a U.S. spy plane over international waters. China was benefiting from the order, but was also directly challenging the U.S. Then, after 9/11, the global war on terror, Zeihan notes most U.S. allies demurred, many actively resisted, contributing in a big way. The U.S. felt kind of alone strategically. And finally, 2002, the Euro launch. A bunch of European countries adopting it explicitly to create a non-American pole of power. Zeihan says that left a lingering distaste in the U.S.
And it wasn't just those big headline moments, right? Zeihan talks about a whole pattern of allies kind of taking advantage.
Yeah, he gives loads of examples that show the friction building up. He talks about China pushing the U.S. Navy back in Asia while still, quote, fully exploiting every aspect of the order, basically having its cake and eating it too. Then you had allies squabbling amongst themselves, Greece and Turkey, South Korea and Japan, all while under the American security umbrella. Even things like espionage. France, Israel, South Korea apparently regularly spied on American companies stealing tech and business plans.
Seriously? Wow.
Yeah. And Spain, after a terror attack in 2004, pulled out of NATO cooperation, not just in the Islamic world, but within NATO itself and NATO funding generally. He says it dropped so low that French troops sometimes have to, rent tourist ferries to move,
Right.
and German military gear often isn't even deployable.
Renting ferries.
It paints a picture. And the bigger trend, U.S. troop drawdowns globally. That's been happening since George W. Bush.
So, okay, the order is fraying, the U.S. is pulling back. Zeihan warns that the consequences are dramatic as this ceiling lifts. What are the biggest impacts he sees coming? Because this sounds like it affects everyone.
Oh, his predictions are pretty stark, especially for the basic global systems we kind of rely on. He forecasts a major global energy shortage. Why? Because of instability piling up in key places like Siberia and the Persian Gulf, all interconnected.
Okay, energy. What else?
Maybe even more worrying, a food supply crisis. He argues famine used to be normal, historically. The order basically banished it, let the global population triple. But now, he says something like 4/5 of the world's food production depends on fuel and fertilizer that often come from totally different continents.
That's fragile.
Extremely. His quote is chilling. Without the order, 1 billion people are going to starve. And similar disruptions for raw materials, manufacturing, development, everything, all over the globe. His point is you need to grasp just how interconnected and, dependent we became under this system and how vulnerable it is without that security blanket.
Okay, so if the old system is breaking down, what does it take for a country to succeed in this new, messier world Zeihan describes? He identifies 4 key things, right?
That's right. In this emerging disorder, as he calls it, self-sufficiency is king. So he looks at 4 fundamentals. First, viable home territories. Good geography, basically. Defensible borders, useful land, internal rivers for transport, that kind of thing.
Geography. Oh,
Second, a reliable food supply. Could you feed your own people without needing imports? Crucial.
makes sense.
Third, sustainable population structure. Demographics. Do you have enough young working age people to support the economy and, the older generation?
Right, demographics. We hear a lot about that.
And fourth, access to stable energy. Can you power your society without relying on vulnerable global supply chains? He argues, if you've got these 4, you're kind of doomed for greatness. If you don't, well, you'll excel at the other thing.
Right, okay, let's use those pillars and dive into some specific countries based on Zeihan's analysis. First up, China. He suggests it's heading for a flameout. Why? What's the issue with its geography?
Well, despite its size, China's core geography is actually pretty challenging. The North China Plain, its heartland, lacks natural barriers. Historically, this made unified rule difficult, leading to cycles of coming together and breaking apart. Plus, you have regions like Tibet and Xinjiang. Zeihan describes the populations there as pathologically hostile to the Han Chinese majority. So internal fragility is a big factor.
Okay, geography's tough. Then he talks about this quadruple bind in agriculture and a mountain of debt. That sounds bad. What are the specifics?
Yeah, the economic picture he paints is grim. Urbanization apparently paved over a lot of their best farmland. So now China has less arable land per person than Saudi Arabia.
Wow. Less than Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. So farming gets pushed onto worse land, needs more inputs, and the whole agricultural sector gets tied into this very fragile, debt-fueled, expansion at all costs financial system. And that debt, Zeihan claims China's internal debt is orders of magnitude larger than the U.S. subprime crisis. Over $15 trillion has led to absurdities like ghost cities built for millions that are just empty.
15 trillion in the demographics. He says China's recent boom was really just the beginning of the end. What does that mean practically?
It means their population's aging incredibly fast. Zeihan projects that by 2030, which is really soon, China could have 4 pensioners for every 2 taxpayers for every 1 child.
4 to 2 to 1.
Yeah. Combine that with the surplus of males from sex-selective abortions and really low birth rates, consumption just has to drop. It's baked in, as he puts it. And critically, their Navy just doesn't have the reach to protect their vital trade routes, especially oil coming all the way from the Persian Gulf. So the idea of China becoming the next global superpower, Zeihan says forget it.
Okay, shifting gears. Japan. Zeihan calls it the world's most aged nation, leading humanity's charge into demographic oblivion. Sounds pretty dire.
It does sound grim, and the aging problem is absolutely real for Japan. It's extreme. But Zeihan points out a couple of the key things. Japan has a super high-tech economy and the financial clout to actually manage elder care differently than most. And, very importantly, they're bringing their nuclear power system back online. This gives them stable internal energy pretty much regardless of what happens globally with oil or gas. He notes they have so much surplus generation capacity, a blackout would basically require like an invasion or a total blockade for weeks.
No, they're resource poor, but they have energy security and tech. How does Zeihan see Japan projecting power then?
He argues Japan has an indubitable advantage in key technologies, robotics, automation, supercomputers. They're world leaders.
No.
And their Navy. He describes Japan's maritime self-defense force as easily the second most powerful expeditionary force in the world, capable of operating far from home. They even build their own F-35 fighter jets under license. His bottom line, in a conflict, the only tankers getting through to East Asia are the ones the Japanese allow. They control their local waters.
Okay, let's move to Europe. Germany, the economic engine, right? But Zeihan says it faces terminal demography. What does that mean for their famous manufacturing sector?
It means big trouble, according to Zeihan. Germany's population is just getting too old. He predicts that by 2030, their workforce under 40 will be less than half the size of the retiree population over 60.
Less than half.
Yeah. So the population becomes too old to actually buy all the stuff German factories produce. Their whole economic model is built on exports. And Zeihan is blunt. In a post-order world without guaranteed global markets, that export model will not work at all.
And he also hints that Germany might revert to an old way. What's he getting at there? Sounds ominous.
He's talking history and geography. Germany's location in the middle of Europe, without many natural defenses to the east or west, has always made it vulnerable. Being embedded in the EU and NATO basically kept Germany contained, prevented it from needing to militarily compete with its neighbors.
Right, it kept the peace.
Exactly. But without the U.S. acting as the ultimate security guarantor, especially containing Russia, Zeihan argues Germany faces renewed strategic pressures right on its borders. He suggests this echoes the kind of pressures that, historically, when combined with economic stress, led to extreme ideologies like Nazism or Leninism. It's a warning about potential instability in Europe's core.
Okay, let's talk Russia. Zion's outlook is bleak, predicting inevitable collapse. What are the demographic facts driving that?
Russia's demographic history is just brutal. Zeihan points to the massive losses in World War I, and especially World War II. 26 million Soviet citizens, mostly young men. Then the chaos after the Soviet collapse. Widespread drug addiction, alcoholism, sky-high death rates for young men. He cites figures like death rates 6 times higher than Iraqi men faced during the U.S. occupation.
6 times.
The result is that Russia's available pool of military-age manpower is now less than a fifth of what it was back in 1989 at the end of the Cold War.
A fifth. So Zeihan says their only real option for defending against a major invasion is nuclear weapons. Why that drastic conclusion?
It comes down to geography and capability. Russia lost its buffer states in Central Europe, making it geographically much more vulnerable, and its conventional military has serious limitations. Zeihan uses the example of their advanced Su-57 fighter jet. They seem incapable of producing more than a single squadron, so they're forced into a static defense posture, trying to hold vast borders, but they just don't have the manpower anymore, which leaves nuclear weapons as the ultimate terrifying backstop.
Wow, okay. Stark contrast, then. France. Zeihan seems quite positive, calling it potentially a durable superpower. What are its geographic advantages?
France geographically is very well set up, according to Zeihan. It has these fantastic internal river systems, the Seine, Rhone, Garonne, others. They link the whole country, north, south, east, west. They're navigable, allowing cheap, easy transport of goods and people. That fosters unity and economic strength.
Internal transport, okay.
Plus, strong natural borders in places the Pyrenees, the Alps, good natural defenses.
And Zeihan says France has a deep understanding of how the pieces fit together. What does that mean for its ambitions in this new era?
He suggests France has always had a shrewder grasp of European power politics, especially regarding managing Germany. And unlike many European countries, it's maintained a strong, independent military capability.
So they can act alone if needed.
Right. Zeihan sees France pursuing neo-imperial goals, particularly in Africa, securing energy from former colonies like Gabon or Algeria. It might even position itself as an energy go-between for a desperate Germany.
But it's not all rosy. He mentions an internal weakness.
Yeah, he points to what he calls a wedge of disunity, deep social and cultural divisions, often along racial lines, particularly with immigrant communities from North Africa. This leads to social stratification, alienation, and, he argues, creates communities that can be exploited by extremist groups. So internal cohesion is a potential Achilles heel.
Okay, one more interesting case. Argentina. Zeihan says its geography is phenomenally well set up. So why does he call its economic history a textbook example of self-destruction?
Yeah, Argentina is geographically blessed. The Rio de la Plata river system, the Pampas grasslands, it's the world's 4th largest chunk of prime, temperate farmland. Perfect for food, great internal transport.
Should be rich, right?
Should be. But then there's Peronism. This political and economic ideology, dominant for decades, involved massive state intervention, huge subsidies for basics like food and electricity. Zeihan argues this led to chronic state debt, rampant corruption, and ultimately crushed the productive parts of the economy. They just haven't lived up to their potential because of politics.
So if the politics have been so bad, why on earth does Zeihan think Argentina might be heading for a golden age in the disorder? That seems completely backwards.
It does, but his logic is interesting. First, its location. Argentina is incredibly isolated, what Zeihan calls beyond the back of beyond. In a world where global trade routes are less secure, being remote is actually a huge advantage. It protects them.
Isolation is a strength. Okay.
Second, the weird side effect of all those subsidies. It created, in his words, a pre-industrial population structure with the skilled labor set of an industrial society. Basically, they have a young, healthy population, unlike aging Europe or China, but one that also has modern skills. So demographically, they're surprisingly well positioned.
Young, skilled, and isolated.
Exactly. Making Argentina, weirdly, a potential shining star when much of the world is facing demographic and economic headwinds. It's definitely one of his most counterintuitive predictions.
All right, let's turn to the U.S. itself. Zion's chapter title is The Distant Superpower. That suggests a pullback, right? What does this American detachment actually look like?
Yeah, distant is the key word. The core idea is that the U.S. is now uniquely self-sufficient. Zeihan stresses it's the least dependent upon the outside world for its help, especially in energy. It's now a net crude oil exporter, which is huge, and food. It can feed itself easily.
So it doesn't need the world as much.
Exactly. And this detachment is also fueled by internal factors, political chaos, basically. Both the Republican and Democratic parties are kind of fractured, internally divided. Plus, there's just a general public weariness with endless foreign interventions, the forever wars. So the U.S. is stepping back from being the global policeman. It doesn't see the need, and politically it's less inclined.
So less military intervention, maybe? But Zeihan talks about a new kind of influence, almost like dollar diplomacy on steroids. How does the U.S. leverage its position now?
Right, it shifts from military power to economic and financial power, where the U.S. is still dominant. The U.S. dollar is still the currency for global trade for commodities. This gives the U.S. enormous leverage. Zeihan suggests the U.S. can basically grant or deny access to the global financial system. It could potentially cripple countries with fragile, dollar-dependent economies. He mentions China, Brazil, the Eurozone as examples.
Wow, weaponizing finance.
Essentially. And it also means a shift towards mercantilism. U.S. companies, backed by this financial power, can go carpetbagging, basically, taking advantage of opportunities in places where other economies are struggling or collapsing. He also predicts a much stronger focus on the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. enforcing, quote, an aggressive exclusion of the East from Latin America, while using its capital, which Latin American countries desperately need to pull the region much tighter into its own economic orbit. He gives examples involving Canada, Mexico, Brazil, even Cuba, all becoming more dependent on U.S. capital and direction.
So the U.S. becomes more inward-looking in some ways, but also more assertive economically in its own neighborhood, and maybe more unpredictable globally.
That's a good way to put it. More self-interested, certainly less bound by the old rules of the order it created, because it has that relative stability, energy, food, decent demographics. Zeihan says the U.S. can effectively wash its hands of everything outside of North America and go home.
Zeihan's final word is that this whole shift, this disorder, will be overwhelming. What's one last, maybe provocative thought from his analysis you want to leave our listeners with as we wrap up this deep dive into the dawning of the Fourth Age?
Well, while the U.S. itself might ride out the storm better than most, think about this. Zeihan warns about America's willing disregard for global security. If the U.S. not only steps back, but actively starts to knock down what pillars remain of the old order, perhaps using that financial power we talked about, then disruption itself could become a tool, a desired outcome of U.S. foreign policy. That would be a world fundamentally different and maybe far more dangerous than anything we've seen since 1945. It's not just the map changing, it's the rules of the game potentially being rewritten entirely.